Well, welcome to The Working Preacher. This is the weekly podcast where we discuss commentary on the lectionary each week, and our professor who normally hosts the podcast is on vacation and left it to some of his students that are currently taking his Gospel of Luke class. So I want to introduce myself, David Horton. I'm a second-year seminary student, and I'm going to turn it over to my colleagues now. Heather.
Hi. I'm Heather Day. I'm a third-year seminary student gearing up to graduate in May.
Awesome. And Jackie?
Hello, I'm Jackie, and I am technically in my final year of an academic MA program.
Awesome. And Timothy?
Hi, and I'm Timothy. Yes, I'm Tim, and final year also. I'm doing CYF, that's my major, Children, Youth, and Family Ministry. And yeah, representing Kenya. Ooh, let's go.
That's very cool. So you can see we have a diverse arrangement of thoughts here, and we're very excited to just try to grapple and wrestle with this text this week. And we're going to start off by having Heather read the text.
All right, and my apologies if my dog makes an appearance. I know that Professor Skinner's dog sometimes makes an appearance in his lectures, so hopefully it won't be looked down upon if Stanley decides to bark at the neighbors like he was just a few minutes ago. So we are looking today at a text from Luke's Gospel from the 20th chapter, starting at verse 1, going through verse 19. So, starting with verse 1. One day, as Jesus was teaching the people in the temple and telling the good news, the chief priests and the scribes came with the elders and said to him, "Tell us, by what authority are you doing these things? Who is it who gave you this authority?" Jesus answered them, "I will also ask you a question, and you tell me. Did the baptism of John come from heaven, or was it of human origin?" They discussed it with one another, saying, "If we say from heaven, he will say, 'Why did you not believe him?' But if we say of human origin, all the people will stone us, for they are convinced that John was a prophet." So they answered that they did not know where it came from. Then Jesus said to them, "Neither will I tell you by what authority I am doing these things." Jesus began to tell the people this parable. A man planted a vineyard and leased it to tenants and went to another country for a long time. When the season came, he sent a slave to the tenants in order that they might give him his share of the produce of the vineyard. But the tenants beat him and sent him away empty-handed. Next, he sent another slave. That one also they beat and insulted and sent away empty-handed. And he sent still a third. This one also they wounded and threw out. Then the owner of the vineyard said, "What shall I do? I will send my beloved son. Perhaps they will respect him." But when the tenants saw him, they discussed it among themselves and said, "This is the heir. Let us kill him so that the inheritance may be ours." So they threw him out of the vineyard and killed him. What then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and destroy those tenants and give the vineyard to others. When they heard this, they said, "Heaven forbid." But he looked at them and said, "What then does this text mean? The stone that the builders rejected has become the cornerstone. Everyone who falls on that stone will be broken to pieces, and it will crush anyone on whom it falls." When the scribes and chief priests realized that he had told this parable against them, they wanted to lay hands on him at that very hour, but they feared the people.
Thank you, Heather. That was beautifully read. And which translation did you use?
This is from the NRSV, which
yes.
in some of the commentaries I was reading points out that the NRSV makes some different choices in some places than some other translations. So
classic.
Yeah.
Do you want to speak to anything more to that, or do you feel like you just want to kind of leave that there for us to keep in mind?
Since I can't think of any of those instances right now, let's just go ahead.
Fair enough. Well, I'd love to just go around and see what kind of jumped out to them in the text? What did they notice? What's still lingering in their minds as they read this text?
For me, I was really struck by that phrase, beloved son, that's just inserted in this parable. We've got slaves being beat. We have just maltreatment, all sorts of very negatively connotated things. And then we have this landowner pondering, perhaps I'll send my beloved son. A nice contrast of language there.
I know for me that one of those last lines, this is verse 18, where everyone who falls on that stone will be broken into pieces and it will crush anyone on whom it falls. I feel like that is a very ominous line, and it does stick out to me.
I was really struck by Jesus's attitude through this, especially as I was reading it aloud. I was feeling just the snark from Jesus where, he said, well, I'm not going to tell you by what authority I'm speaking either. Just really testy. It felt like he was just testy with them and had this attitude. And so feeling that kind of coming through the text, it just really caught.
Yes. Sorry. Yeah, I enjoyed the reading by Heather. It's one of my favorite Bible verses, actually. I agree with what Heather said, and when I think about what stands out to me in that story is just how it's the intro of the story about Jesus and Jesus should always be the center, the focal point of everything that we do. So whenever we look into a story, we should see are we focusing on Jesus or are we focusing on the other people around the story? So I like that Jesus should always be the center of it.
Great point. Thank you for that. Well, I feel like we should kind of maybe put this into context a little bit. So before this, we had just in chapter 19, we have Jesus cleansing the temple. Well, first he is processing into Jerusalem, that triumphant entry. And then we do have Jesus weeping over Jerusalem, and then Jesus cleansing the temple. So all those three kind of big events move us into this story. And then, of course, after this, we have the beginnings of the Passion narrative. So I'm just wondering where our thoughts are with that progression in the context of this story, where the story lies in the context of those events.
Yeah, I think it's interesting and probably important to note that at the end of chapter 19, where Jesus comes in and cleanses the temple and gets angry, and then it goes on to say every day he was teaching in the temple, which is where we find him at the beginning of chapter 20. But then it says that the chief priests, scribes, and the leaders of the people kept looking for a way to kill him. But they didn't find any way because the people were spellbound by what they heard from Jesus. So the people are on Jesus's side at this point. They are, seeing him as an important teacher, but these leaders were looking for a way to kill him. So coming into this, where they're asking him this trick question, they're obviously looking for a way to get him to say something that will implicate himself in some way. So that just seems like an important thing to notice.
I agree.
I like the idea of temple, the context of that. The temple was so important to this community. Everything revolved around the temple, So the fact that this is where people met, is where religious authorities met, where people came to do business, where Jesus himself comes. But then Jesus doesn't do what other people would do. Jesus does something else, so that's unique.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Do we feel like this plays into Lucian's whole kind of thesis with everything in its right place and at the right time and the orderly storytelling of Jesus? Do we feel like this, do we think that Luke was being very specific about this parable's placement in the context of this story? And what do we think Luke is saying about that?
Well, I think there's a pretty good argument for that because Jesus' own authority has just been challenged. He seems well aware of the fact that the leaders, that group that Luke often classifies as his enemies, are plotting against him. He's preparing for his passion. And then we have this parable that in many ways seems very allegorical of the leaders rejecting Jesus. It's the authority of the landowner, the authority of those sent on his behalf. in a way that ultimately leads to the beloved son's death. So I think it seems very well and intentionally placed within that context of Jesus's life, Jesus's story, almost as a way for him to provide his own commentary and critique on the behavior of those leaders.
Very good point. I have to agree. I think it definitely is falling into a rightful place in Luke's mind, excuse me. And it does feel a little bit of a foreshadow. I'm curious to know, who do we think the tenants are in this story? In other words, who is Jesus speaking to in this story?
Now, I'm trying to remember which commentary I read this in, and I want to say maybe it was in Gonzalez's commentary, where he talked about the different interpretations of this at different points in time, and how, early readers of this, so maybe Luke's initial audience, would have read the tenants as maybe being Israelites or Jews, who, see these prophets, the slaves, the prophets, coming to them, and then Jesus, the beloved son, coming to them and then rejecting them, or, maybe the leaders of the Jews being the tenants. But then the commentary also talked about how during the kind of patristic time of the church, that there was a more, a really anti-Jewish feeling to it, where the whole story is talking about the Israel's inheritance being taken away from Israel and given to the Christian church. So this really anti-Jewish feeling. So not so much being that the tenants are the leaders and the scribes and the elders, but being the whole Jewish people, which is it's a lot more anti-Jewish setup than just saying that the tenants are, maybe the leaders, the scribes.
I'm glad you brought that up. That's a very good point. I think that was the commentary in Gonzalez that was talking about that. Yeah. I think that's a very good point, because I feel like understanding who these people are really gets us away from making sure that we're not putting any subconscious stereotypes or things like that on the Jewish people. So I think it's kind of reconciling, who do we want to see this story being told to? And for me, it seems like these are, I don't know, for me, I want to see it as like, these are the people that have putting Luke in the later years of when this gospel would have been told and written down. It seems like we would have been speaking to a more Gentile crowd. So maybe these are people that are very new to the faith or don't know anything about the faith. And I think that can get us away from that anti-Semitic. So that's good. Thank you for bringing that up, Heather.
Gonzalez even, I think, takes it a step further in carrying it as a word of warning to leaders today. Just as, so verse 19 talks about how the scribes and the chief priests sought to lay hands on him at that very hour, for they perceived that he told this parable against them. It was the leaders that took issue with the parable, not the people in general. And so Gonzalez kind of puts that question to us as church leaders of today. Are you taking issue with this parable? Are you being challenged by it, rather than maybe the people that you're called to serve? So that does help remove any of that cultural bias or anything like that. It really makes it personal.
Any other thoughts on that?
Thinking about Gonzalez's commentary, I had a note about that too, Jackie, and I have written down that maybe we are the tenants of in the vineyard, is God's whole creation, and that this has been given to us to be caretakers of, and that I just wrote down that we know what is good, but we don't do what we know to be good. Which, kind of references, somewhere else. Somebody else can help me with that.
I just want to say amen to that.
Somewhere in the Bible. Right, but that, yeah, thinking about it in present day and taking that personally, that if we are the tenants, then, as church leaders or just as Christians living in a quote unquote Christian nation, what does that mean for us?
Definitely. I'm curious to know, who is the landowner in this story? Is it an allegory? It appears that the landowner is God. Mm-hmm. And if so, are we comfortable with that? And then I would say the follow-up question is God absent in this story, or the absent, or the kind of like, is he or she or it, God, sorry, didn't mean to put a gender on there, but is God absent in taking care of the tenants and keeping control of everything?
Mm-hmm.
That's a good question. That's interesting. You know what? I think that as a landowner, the fact that he seems absent and he entrusts the land to the tenants is a sense of trust. It's kind of like, I don't know if your parents ever traveled and left you. I think in the US that's not legal anymore, leaving your kids at home. Maybe depends on the age, but from where I come from, especially if my parents traveled, they would leave the oldest. Like my older brother would be in charge of all of us, and he'd be responsible in taking care of us. And my brother he used to take that, he would be the dad, and he would try to be, use that authority on us, unfortunately. But when I think about this, the landowner trusts the tenant. So it's not that he's absent, but he knows that, God knows that, okay, I'm entrusting this to you. I trust you. I think of it that way.
That feels a lot more reassuring.
Yes, it does point us towards more hope. Yeah.
Some of the commentaries and things put it in the context of stewardship. So I think that's a more helpful framework for us to consider it. But on the other hand, it seems like the tenants considered the landowner to be absentee because they come up with this logic: if we kill the inheritor, then the land will become ours. So they must think the owner is far away enough or absent enough that, if they do away with the people he's sending, they will get the land, which, isn't logically how that would happen unless the landowner is removed enough that he's not going to come back himself. So they seem to have that mindset that, they're alone, or the landowner is absent enough. But I don't think that's the reality, and that's why they run into issues. So I like that stewardship framework and that trust that Tim mentioned, that it's not that the landowner has separated himself, it's that he's extended a certain amount of trust, that he's asked the tenants to operate with him. That was maybe different than what they were expecting, and so that's where some of the issues come from.
I like that.
Yeah, I do too. I think that it almost seems heavy-handed to say that God is the owner of the vineyard. Like, the allegory in this just feels so heavy-handed, that especially when you come up with the beloved son, wording that, like, of course God is the landowner, and then the beloved son is Jesus, and this is a foreshadowing of the passion, which is probably part of it. But then I get to verse 16, when it's saying, what then will the owner of the vineyard do to them? He will come and destroy those tenants and give the vineyard to others. And I always get uncomfortable with that language of destruction and thinking about God destroying people or, anything.
I do
So,
too.
so maybe it's just that the allegory only goes so far, that allegories are just that they're allegories and they're not exactly what they are, a metaphor for.
And I'm almost curious too, with that whole, the tenant is going to come back, or the landowner is going to come back and smite the tenants, the wicked tenants. How do we deal with that morally? Are we kind of rejoicing in that commendation of others? Do we kind of like that a little bit? Do we want to see that happen?
I believe we shouldn't. I believe that we should, if you look at the context, Jesus weeps over Jerusalem. And the fact that he shares this is a story to tell them that, I'm weeping for you. I don't want this to happen to you. I don't want this to, I want you to be saved, but you rejected me. So it's with that mournful state that he tells them this story. And for us as well, we don't want to see, like God punish or destroy the wicked or something. We want all to be saved. So we shouldn't rejoice at all.
Tim, I like that idea that Jesus's mindset is more of a mournful mindset than a snarky mindset, like what I was reading in the first part of chapter 20. That seems a lot more in character.
Yeah.
So I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
Well, so I'm curious, as we kind of have some final thoughts here, where do you see yourself in your context using this parable or preaching on this parable or teaching this parable? What's next for you? I can't help but think of my current situation in that I live in a building in the city of Seattle, and I am becoming frustrated with our land or an owner. Well, I shouldn't say landowner, but the person overseeing our building who seems a little absent. And so the garbage is not being really well taken care of, and people are just kind of throwing their boxes in the recycling without breaking them down. There's not really any signs up about wearing masks while walking through the building. We have dogs that are barking that people are complaining about, but nothing ever really seems to get happen. So I feel like this absent, building owner, and things are starting to fall a little bit apart. And I'm curious to know, why isn't our community just stepping up and helping to take care of each other? Why aren't we choosing to wear masks in the building? Why aren't we trying to hold responsible our pets? Why are we not just trying to break down garbage and be more compassionate for each other? And I'm wondering, what is it that humans need to kind of start taking ownership for their experience and when they're living in a community? Do we need somebody here to kind of oversee everything and to lay down the law and issue the rules, or can we just kind of exist without it? So that's kind of just an area that I'm contemplating in my own context.
Mm-hmm. One theme I've been trying to reconcile as I consider this parable is we talked a lot in our whole reading of Luke of how he has this monumental task of incorporating the crucifixion into the idea of Messiah. That was so foreign. And as I read this parable, I don't get any sense of sacrifice on behalf of the beloved son. It seems like a crime has been perpetrated against him, against the landowner and all the slaves and servants that were sent. And so it's really been, I've been wrestling with it in my mind of, what is Luke saying about Jesus's upcoming crucifixion, about the whole passion, the resurrection, the ascension, the whole portrayal of Jesus as Messiah. And I just wonder if it says more about our attitude toward maybe messianic expectations than maybe than the reality that Jesus is living out, because it seems like a logical progression that Jesus is laying out, that almost a David and Nathan moment of you are that man to these tenants of, you get what's coming to you. And I appreciated your comments, Tim, about I don't think Jesus was seeking that sweet justice that we might, of being able to point to those pendants and point out their mistreatment of things. Perhaps he is mourning it, but I think for me, as I teach this, maybe the lesson is more in my attitude as a leader and how I can avoid following that logical progression, knowing that it's easy for things to snowball and get to this point naturally, and to hold on to law, hold on to deeds, and miss the beloved Son and the grace and just the relationship that he's desiring to lay out for all people. So just kind of without full resolution, it just forces me to keep my perspective in check, especially as I seek to be a leader and bring other people to Jesus, just to maybe try and cut the snowball effect off and not get to the point that the wicked tenants did, knowing where Jesus is going to end up, what he's going to endure, what he's going to overcome for me and for all people.
Well said, Jackie.
Mm-hmm.
Man, thank you, Jackie. I think I'll go next, and then let Heather will finalize it. Heather always has some inspiring thoughts. All right,
Sure.
So for me, my context is, first of all, when I look at this, I'm taking it from Christ's context and then putting it in my context. I think about vineyard in our time, the householder of the vineyard. I think about tenants. I think about servants who were sent to collect the fruit, the owner's son, the wall or the edge, the tower, all these things. What do they represent? The thing that I look at this is, I think the parable refers to us as tenants. And I think that it can also mean, if you think about it, it mean more than, we can also be other things in that parable, but tenants is the primary focus. In my context, when I look at this parable, I think about what is my takeaway in this is that the Pharisees were too proud to be corrected. And sometimes we may feel like we as theologians, as pastors, sometimes we feel like we know it all, and we should be careful not to be too proud to be corrected. So Jesus, then this was the thing, that they rejected Jesus because they thought they were better than Jesus. So they were too proud to be corrected. We should be careful not to be that proud. And it's heartbreaking to realize that the Pharisees and the chief priests understood a parable, but they didn't respond with repentance. So their response, they understood it, but they didn't respond the way Jesus wanted them to respond. So we need to ponder this word. So in my context, when I share this parable, I would like people to know that, yes, we live in a world where we want to build wine presses, we want to be prosperous, we want to accomplish all these things. But then in doing that, are we forsaking to, how do I put this? Are we becoming proud? Are we being so proud of our accomplishments that we reject the one, the owner, the one who has given us all this blessing? So those are my thoughts. They're a bit random, but I hope they make sense.
Beautiful, Timothy.
Yeah, you gave me a great springboard to come off of, Tim. Thank you for that. I was thinking about using this, in my context. I think a lot about lay leadership in the church, and I see that us as the tenants. I guess let me just say at the church leadership as the tenants here. And when you're saying that the Pharisees are too proud to be corrected, and so they rejected Jesus instead of responding with repentance, I think about what that means as church leadership. I think it's easy, and I see this in my context, for leadership in churches to be so proud that they don't rely on God. And so this idea of the owner being far away and the tenants with, caretaking of the vineyard. If we as church leaders are caretakers of the vineyard, right, it's not thinking so much of the owner abdicating the vineyard, but instead entrusting us with that. And so, I see in my context, church leaders being very practical and using their business experience to run the church as a business, and not, at a church council meeting, doing a very perfunctory devotion at the start, but not actually engaging with what the Holy Spirit might have in mind for our congregation and our context. And so that idea of being too proud and not responding with repentance, but instead responding with rejection, that's just really speaking to me about church leadership rejecting God's leading and not even realizing it, right? So maybe not as explicitly as in this parable, but that idea that no, God is the owner, we are the caretakers, God entrusts us with that. And so, it's really making me reflect on what that might mean, or how this parable might be read in the context of, say, a church council, or some kind of church leadership.
For sure. That's some good stuff. I feel like I'm hearing humbleness, respect to creation, all sorts of things that are really great to bring into our ministry context. Mm-hmm. Well, we're running out of time, so I'm just curious if anybody has any last thoughts before we close up.
I thought you've done a really great job leading us, David. Thank you.
Well, this group has been so engaging. It's so easy.
I just wanted to add that for those who don't know about this podcast, is that we have been as spontaneous as we can be, because we were not planning to record. But it has been fun just reading this parable, and parables are always meant to teach us, and that's what we can always use these parables to bless our communities. And parables are like, for me, I feel parables, we learn from them every day. We will glean from them each and every day. We will just look at those parables. You get new information every time you read them. So thank you for leading us, David. It was nice talking with you all, Jackie and Heather. It's been a good class.
That's a beautiful blessing to send us out on, Timothy. Thank you. May the parables keep speaking volumes to you, and may our professors never ask us to do podcasts for them again. With that said, I hope you all have a good rest of your day.
Thanks.